The dinosaurs. For roughly 165 million years, dinosaurs were the dominant land animals on the planet. They ranged across every continent, including Antarctica. They included the largest creatures ever to walk on land, the long-necked sauropods, and some of the most ferocious predators, the great theropods like Tyrannosaurus rex. They diversified into thousands of species, filling every ecological role. Then, 66 million years ago, they were nearly all gone within a geological instant. The cause is now well established. An asteroid roughly 10 kilometers across struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, leaving the Chicxulub crater behind. The impact released energy equivalent to billions of atomic bombs, ignited global wildfires, threw enormous quantities of dust and sulfate aerosols into the atmosphere, and caused a multi-year winter that collapsed the food chains the dinosaurs depended on. Within a few thousand years, around 75% of all species on Earth were extinct. What survived was sparse and small. Mammals, then mostly rodent-sized creatures hiding in burrows, made it through. So did certain birds, which had evolved from a branch of small theropod dinosaurs. The crocodiles, the turtles, and a handful of other lineages came through. The age of giant reptiles was over. The age of mammals, which would eventually produce humans, was about to begin. Modern science can reconstruct the impact, the dust layer, and the family trees of the survivors. The dinosaurs themselves are known from bones, teeth, footprints, fossilized eggs, and the occasional preserved skin. They were the most successful large land animals in the history of the planet. They were deleted from reality so completely that, until the early 1800s, humans did not even know they had ever existed. Neanderthals. For roughly 400,000 years, a species of human walked the landscapes of Europe and Western Asia. Homo neanderthalensis, commonly called Neanderthals, after the German valley where the first recognized fossils were found in the 1850s, were shorter and stockier than modern humans, with larger brains and heavier brow ridges. They survived several ice ages, hunted large game with stone-tipped spears, controlled fire, buried their dead with ritual goods, and made cave paintings. They were sophisticated, social, and adapted to some of the harshest climates of the late Pleistocene. Around 40,000 years ago, they vanished. The last confirmed Neanderthal remains date from roughly that time, in southern Iberia. The cause is still debated. Competition with the modern humans who had arrived in Europe a few thousand years earlier. Climate change, disease, interbreeding that absorbed Neanderthal genes into a much larger Homo sapiens population. The full answer is probably a combination, with no single factor sufficient on its own. What they left behind is unusual for an extinct species. Their genome has been recovered from fossil bones and is now sequenced in detail. Most people of non-African ancestry today carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA, the result of ancient interbreeding events. Some Neanderthal inherited genes affect modern human immunity, skin biology, and risk of certain diseases. They are gone as a distinct population, yet a small piece of them still lives in most of us. The Neanderthals were not a primitive caricature. They were people, by any reasonable definition. They had culture, language, family, and grief. They walked the same valleys we do. Then, within the span of a few thousand years, they were edited out of the human family, leaving only bones, tools, and the genetic ghost they passed on to their cousins. The dodo. The dodo was a large, flightless bird that lived only on the island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. Standing about a meter tall, with a heavy curved beak and reduced wings, it had evolved on an island with no mammalian predators. Food was plentiful, the climate was mild, and the dodo had no need to fly or to fear anything that approached it. It was, by all accounts, gentle, curious, and entirely fearless of humans. The Dutch first reached Mauritius in 1598. The dodo, which had no instinct to flee, walked up to sailors who promptly killed and ate it. The meat was reportedly tough and not especially tasty, but it was easy to obtain. Worse than the hunting was the menagerie of animals the Europeans brought with them. Pigs, rats, dogs, cats, and monkeys all preyed on dodo eggs and chicks, which were laid on the ground. The forests where the dodo lived were cleared for sugar plantations. Within roughly 80 years, the dodo was extinct. The last confirmed sighting dates from around 1662. There are no surviving complete specimens, a handful of bones, a few 17th century paintings, and a single dried head and foot in an Oxford museum collection are all that remains. Modern reconstructions of what the bird actually looked like still rely on partial guesswork. The dodo became famous after its extinction, not before. The bird that gave the English language the phrase "as dead as a dodo" was the first species whose disappearance was clearly understood by the public as a direct result of human action. It was deleted from reality so completely that for centuries after, even naturalists debated whether it had ever been real. It was real. It is gone. The Soviet Union. For most of the 20th century, two great powers shaped the geopolitical map of the planet. The United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics divided much of the world between competing economic systems, ideologies, and nuclear arsenals. The Soviet Union spanned 11 time zones, included 15 republics, and at its peak controlled the destinies of more than 290 million people. It had its own space program, its own films, its own answers to almost every question the modern world could ask. It ended in 1991, almost without violence on the scale most expected. The economic system had been quietly failing for years. Reform efforts under Mikhail Gorbachev, including glasnost and perestroika, loosened central control, but could not generate the productivity gains the country needed. One by one, the satellite states of Eastern Europe broke away. Then, in August of 1991, a failed coup by hardliners in Moscow accelerated the disintegration of the central state. By December, the Soviet Union was formally dissolved. The map redrew itself in months. 15 new independent states took the places of the old republics. Russia, the largest of them, kept the seat at the United Nations, the nuclear weapons, and most of the heavy industry. The other republics set off on independent paths, sometimes with great difficulty. The strangest aspect is how quietly it ended. A state that had spent decades preparing for nuclear war, that had armies in every direction and missiles aimed at the other side of the world, simply ceased to exist. The flag came down over the Kremlin one evening in December. The people who had lived under that flag woke up the next morning in a country with a different name. A second superpower had been deleted from the political map in a single year. The Aztec Empire. When the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of what is now Mexico in 1519, the Aztec Empire was at the height of its power. The Mexica people who led the empire controlled a network of subject states across central Mesoamerica. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, sat on an island in Lake Texcoco and held some 200,000 residents, making it larger than any European city of the period. The empire collected tribute from millions, maintained an enormous army, and built temples that towered over the lake. By August of 1521, that empire was gone. Cortés, with perhaps 500 Spanish soldiers and tens of thousands of indigenous allies who resented Aztec rule, marched on Tenochtitlan, broke the city's defenses after a long siege, and destroyed its central structures. The Emperor Cuauhtémoc was captured and later executed. The Aztec political system was effectively erased within months. The deeper cause was not military skill, but disease. Smallpox, brought by a single infected Spanish soldier in 1520, swept through the indigenous population of central Mexico. The Mexica had no immunity. Within a year, the disease killed somewhere between a quarter and a half of the empire's people, including the Emperor Cuitlahuac. The siege of Tenochtitlan happened in a city already weakened by mass death. Some estimates put the total population loss across the region over the following century at around 90%. Modern Mexico City sits directly on top of the buried ruins of Tenochtitlan. The lake has been drained, the canals filled in, the great temples broken up for cathedral stone. The descendants of the Mexica are still there. The empire they built is not. It was deleted from the political map within a single human lifetime. Megalodon. For about 20 million years, between roughly 23 million and 3.5 million years ago, the seas of Earth contained a predator unlike anything alive today. Megalodon, formerly Otodus megalodon, was a shark that grew to lengths of around 15 to 18 meters, weighing perhaps 60 tons. Its teeth, the most commonly preserved part, could be larger than a human hand. For comparison, the great white shark, the largest predatory shark alive today, reaches only about 6 meters at the top of its range. Megalodon hunted whales, dolphins, large fish, and probably anything else big enough to make the chase worthwhile. Fossil whale bones from the period show the distinctive bite marks of megalodon teeth, sometimes with teeth still embedded in the skeleton. It was, by every available measure, the apex marine predator of its time, with no other animal large enough to seriously threaten it. The cause of its extinction is debated. The cooling of the oceans during the late Pliocene reduced the warm, shallow seas where megalodon raised its young. The whales it depended on shifted their migration patterns toward colder waters that megalodon could not easily follow. New competitors, including the ancestors of modern killer whales, may have outcompeted it for prey. Whatever the precise mechanism, megalodon disappeared roughly 3.5 million years ago, before humans existed. What remains is the teeth, which are abundant in coastal sediments around the world. Skeletons are rare because shark cartilage rarely fossilizes. The full anatomy of megalodon is reconstructed largely from the teeth and a small handful of vertebral fragments. The biggest predatory fish in the history of the planet swam through the same oceans we sail today, and it has left behind almost nothing but its bite. The mammoths. Mammoths were a family of large, hairy elephants that lived across the cold steppes of Eurasia and North America during the Pleistocene, the long ice age that began roughly 2.5 million years ago. The most famous species, the woolly mammoth, stood about 3 meters at the shoulder with long curved tusks, a thick coat of dark hair, and a hump of fat on its back. At their peak, mammoths ranged across grasslands that stretched from Spain to Alaska in herds of dozens. The end of the Pleistocene, around 12,000 years ago, brought rapid climate change. The grasslands the mammoths depended on shrank as forests and tundra advanced. At the same time, modern humans equipped with stone-tipped spears and organized hunting techniques arrived in the regions where mammoths had previously had no predators. The combination was devastating. Population after population collapsed. Cave paintings across Europe show mammoths being hunted, butchered, and mourned by the people who depended on them. By around 10,000 years ago, the great mainland populations of mammoths were gone. A few small island populations held on for thousands of years longer, including the famously late survivors on Wrangel Island in the Arctic. But the era of mammoths walking across continental Eurasia and North America had ended. What survives is unusually intimate. Mammoths froze into permafrost as they died, and Russian and Siberian researchers have recovered carcasses with skin, hair, stomach contents, and even mother's milk in the bellies of calves. Modern genetics has reconstructed the mammoth genome in detail. They walked the same continents humans now occupy. Within a few thousand years, hunting and climate together had deleted them from reality. Atlantis. The story of Atlantis comes from 2 dialogues written by the Greek philosopher Plato in the 4th century before the Common Era. He describes a great island civilization lying somewhere west of the Pillars of Hercules that ruled a vast empire and possessed technology beyond anything else of its time. Then, according to Plato, the gods grew displeased with the Atlanteans. In a single day and night of catastrophic earthquakes and floods, the entire island sank into the sea, taking its civilization with it. For more than 2,000 years after Plato wrote those words, people have searched for the location of Atlantis. The proposed sites span the world: the Azores, Antarctica, the Bahamas, the Mediterranean island of Santorini, the Bolivian Altiplano. Each proposal has produced books, expeditions, and a small library of speculation. None has produced a confirmed identification of any actual sunken civilization matching Plato's description. The scholarly consensus is that Plato invented Atlantis as a philosophical fable, a thought experiment about the dangers of pride and overreach. The earlier Greek historians say nothing about Atlantis. No archaeological site matches the scale Plato describes. The most popular partial match is the Minoan civilization, which suffered a catastrophic volcanic eruption on the island of Thera around 1500 before the Common Era. The Minoans may have inspired some of Plato's details, but they were not Atlantis. What remains is the idea Atlantis has been deleted from history, if it ever was in history, but it lives on in nearly every culture as the archetype of the lost civilization. The fact that the search continues fruitlessly for over 2 millennia is evidence of something real, even if not of the city itself. It is the persistence of the human longing for a great vanished past, hidden just below the waves. The Concorde. Between 1976 and 2003, ordinary travellers with enough money could cross the Atlantic in less than 4 hours at twice the speed of sound. The Concorde, jointly developed by Britain and France, was the only supersonic passenger aircraft ever to operate at commercial scale. It cruised at 60,000 feet, well above other traffic, at around 2,000 kilometers per hour. From London to New York, the journey was shorter than a long lunch. Only 20 Concordes were ever built. Operations were split between British Airways and Air France. The development costs were enormous, the fuel consumption was punishing, and the aircraft was banned from supersonic flight over land because of its sonic boom. Tickets were expensive, often several times the price of conventional first class. The flights still tended to sell out. Passengers included celebrities, business executives, and ordinary people willing to save up for one trip in a lifetime. The decline came from several directions. The September 11 attacks in 2001 cut into demand. A fatal crash in 2000 at Paris damaged the Concorde's reputation and led to expensive grounding. Rising fuel prices made the operation harder to justify. By 2003, both airlines had retired their fleets. The last commercial Concorde flight landed at London Heathrow on the 24th of October. Since then, no supersonic passenger aircraft has flown commercially. 20 years on from the last Concorde flight, travellers crossing the Atlantic move at roughly the same speed their grandparents did in the 1960s. Several startups have proposed new supersonic designs, but none has yet flown a passenger. A capability that humanity briefly held and that defined a particular dream of the future has been quietly deleted from the present. Ninth planet. Pluto was discovered in 1930 by the American astronomer Clyde Tombaugh working at the Lowell Observatory in Arizona. From the moment of its discovery, it was classified as the 9th planet of the solar system, the small, distant, icy world at the cold edge of the Sun's family. For the next 76 years, every schoolchild in the world learned to recite 9 planets, ending with Pluto. It appeared on lunchboxes, on classroom posters, in songs, and in popular culture as the lonely outermost world. Then, in 2006, the International Astronomical Union met in Prague and changed the definition of what counts as a planet. The new definition required a body to clear the neighborhood around its orbit, meaning it must be gravitationally dominant in its region of space. Pluto, surrounded by countless other small icy objects in the Kuiper belt, did not qualify. It was reclassified as a dwarf planet, a new category that also included several other bodies. The reaction was not what astronomers expected. Schools updated their materials, songs were rewritten, lunchboxes were quietly retired. But the public, particularly in the United States where Pluto had been discovered, refused to fully accept the decision. New Hampshire, Tombaugh's home state, briefly considered legislation declaring Pluto a planet within state boundaries. Astronomers continued to receive complaint letters years later. Pluto itself, of course, neither knew nor cared. In 2015, the NASA New Horizons spacecraft flew past Pluto and returned the first detailed images. The world that had been demoted turned out to be geologically complex, with mountains of water ice, a heart-shaped plain of frozen nitrogen, and a thin blue atmosphere. The planet humans had deleted from the solar system was, on closer inspection, more interesting than anyone had guessed. Sea peoples. For about a century at the end of the Bronze Age, a coalition of raiders descended on the eastern Mediterranean. They burned cities along the coast of modern Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. They fought the Egyptians on land and sea, leaving carved records of their defeat on the walls of temples. They contributed to the collapse of the Hittite Empire, the destruction of Mycenaean Greece, and the disappearance of half a dozen smaller kingdoms. The Egyptians called them simply the Sea Peoples. Nobody knows for certain where they came from or where they went. Egyptian reliefs from the reign of Ramesses III, around 1279 before the Common Era, show distinctive headgear, ox carts and ships, suggesting a mixed migration of families rather than a single army. Scholars have proposed origins in Sardinia, Sicily, the Aegean, Western Anatolia, the Levant, and the Black Sea. None of the candidates has overwhelming archaeological support. The Sea Peoples appear, devastate, and recede with little trace of their origin. Their disappearance is as strange as their arrival. Some are thought to have settled in the southern Levant and become the Philistines of the Hebrew Bible. Others may have melted back into the populations of the regions they came from. The bulk of them simply vanish from the historical record. Within a generation, the carved boats and feather hats and ox carts of the temple walls have no echo anywhere on the map. The collapse they accelerated was so severe that writing systems were lost across much of the Mediterranean for centuries afterward. With them went any independent accounts of who the Sea Peoples were. The only voice left is the Egyptian one, and the Egyptians spoke of strangers from far away. The strangers themselves left no records, no monuments, and no firm address to send a reply to. Bronze collapse. For roughly 1,000 years before 1200, before the Common Era, the Eastern Mediterranean was one of the most interconnected economies in the ancient world. Egyptian pharaohs traded gold and grain with the Hittite emperors of Anatolia. Mycenaean Greeks shipped wine and olive oil to Cyprus. Tin from as far away as Afghanistan moved through the ports of the Levant. Diplomatic letters between kings, written in cuneiform on clay tablets, addressed each other as brother. The world had something close to a globalized system. Within about 50 years, around 1200 before the Common Era, the entire system collapsed. The Hittite capital was burned and abandoned. Mycenaean palaces fell, never to be rebuilt. Major cities along the Levantine coast were sacked one after the next. Egypt survived, but weakened and never again exercised the same imperial reach. Long-distance trade routes withered. Some regions returned to such basic conditions that writing was forgotten entirely. The Greek world, in particular, lost literacy for nearly 4 centuries. No single cause has held up under scrutiny. Earthquakes, droughts, internal revolts, the Sea Peoples, sudden climate cooling, and the failure of trade networks have each been blamed. Most modern scholars suspect a combination, with one shock triggering the next. The complexity of the network may have been its weakness. When several supports gave way at once, the whole structure pulled itself apart. What is most striking is how complete the erasure was. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years became fields of rubble. Languages disappeared. Skills like writing in linear scripts went with them. The people did not all die, but the world they lived in, the connected Bronze Age, did. It has never been put back together. Lost Colony. In 1587, an English expedition led by John White established a small settlement on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina. There were about 115 colonists, including White's own daughter and his newborn granddaughter Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. White returned to England later that year to gather more supplies. War with Spain delayed his return for nearly 3 years. When he finally sailed back in 1590, the colony was gone. The houses had been carefully dismantled. There were no signs of struggle, no graves, no bodies. The only clues were two carved messages. One word, Croatoan, was cut into a post by the main gate. The letters CRO were cut into a nearby tree. White interpreted these as a planned move to Croatoan, an island to the south where a friendly local people lived. Bad weather forced him to leave before he could investigate, and he never made it back. Theories about what happened have multiplied for over 400 years. The colonists may have integrated with the Croatoan people, who later became known as the Hatteras. They may have moved inland and merged with other tribes. They may have died from disease, starvation, or attack. Genetic studies of nearby native populations and archaeological digs on Hatteras Island have turned up suggestive but not conclusive evidence of European admixture and trade goods. What is certain is that no group of survivors ever made contact with later English settlers, who arrived in numbers within a few decades. 115 people simply walked off the historical map. The most famous lost colony in the English-speaking world remains, in any precise sense, lost. Mother culture. The Olmec are often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, flourishing along the lowland coast of what is now southern Mexico. From around 1500 to 400 before the Common Era, they built the first known great cities of the region, carved colossal stone heads weighing many tons each, and developed practices, gods, and possibly writing systems that later cultures, including the Maya and the Aztec, inherited. By around 400 before the Common Era, the major Olmec centers had been abandoned. The cities of San Lorenzo and La Venta, with their plazas, ball courts, and giant carved heads, were left to the jungle. The Olmec did not all die. Their genetic descendants probably still live in the region. But the specific civilization they had built, with its art style, its political structure, and its religious centers, simply stopped functioning. The collapse has no single accepted explanation. Climate change, particularly the rise of sea levels and changes in river courses that flooded their agricultural land, is the leading suspect. Civil conflict, attacks by other peoples, and the depletion of resources have also been proposed. The colossal heads, some of which weigh more than 20 tons, were deliberately defaced before being abandoned, suggesting that the end was at least partly violent. What followed was an absence. For several centuries after the Olmec, no comparable centers of power emerged in the same area. The art, the writing, and the political institutions did not transfer cleanly to a successor state. Later, Mesoamerican civilizations would borrow from Olmec models, but they did so from a distance, in time and in space. The first great Mesoamerican civilization rose, ruled, and then quietly walked away from its own monuments. Buried Temple. On a hilltop in southeastern Turkey sits the oldest known megalithic site on Earth. Göbekli Tepe consists of large circular enclosures formed by T-shaped limestone pillars, some of them more than 5 meters tall, decorated with carvings of foxes, scorpions, snakes, and abstract human figures. The site was built between roughly 9,500 and 8,000 before the Common Era, predating Stonehenge by some 6,000 years and pottery by several thousand more. What makes the site even stranger is what happened to it. Around 8,000 before the Common Era, the builders deliberately filled the entire complex with rubble, soil, and debris. Each enclosure was buried under tons of fill, hiding the pillars completely. The site was then abandoned. It remained covered, undisturbed, for 10,000 years until archaeologists led by Klaus Schmidt began excavating it in the 1990s. Nobody knows why a community would invest enormous labor in carving and erecting such pillars, only to bury them. Various explanations have been proposed. Ritual closure of a sacred site, changes in religious belief, loss of social significance, preservation against weathering. None of the theories has reached consensus. The deliberate burial is one of the most peculiar acts of large-scale archaeology known anywhere on Earth. The builders themselves remain mysterious. They lived before settled agriculture, before the domestication of most animals, before writing. Yet they organized the labor of hundreds of people to quarry, carve, transport, and erect stone pillars weighing many tons. They held complex symbolic ideas long enough to record them in stone. They then erased their own record under earth and walked away. The hill at Göbekli Tepe held their secrets silently for 10,000 years. Lost empire. For nearly 500 years, the Hittites ruled one of the great powers of the ancient world. Their capital, Hattusa, in the high plains of central Anatolia, was a city of stone walls, double gates, and royal archives written in cuneiform on clay tablets. The Hittite kings corresponded with Egyptian pharaohs as equals. They fought one of the largest chariot battles in ancient history at Kadesh in 1274 before the Common Era and negotiated what is sometimes called the world's first surviving peace treaty. Around 1200 before the Common Era, the empire ended. Hattusa was burned and abandoned. The royal records cease abruptly. The territory the Hittites had ruled fragmented into smaller successor states that called themselves Neo-Hittite, but did not control the same lands or resources. Within a generation, a major power of the Bronze Age world had effectively erased itself from the political map. The causes are debated. A major drought, evident in ice core and tree ring records, weakened agriculture. Internal struggles among the ruling families had been ongoing for years. Attacks by neighboring peoples and the wider Sea Peoples movement added pressure. The trade networks the empire depended on were collapsing in parallel. The Hittites probably suffered all of these at once. What is unusual is how thoroughly they were forgotten. The Hittites had vast archives, an extensive language, and a sophisticated diplomatic culture. Yet for nearly 3,000 years after their fall, they were known to history only as a vague biblical reference. Hattusa was rediscovered in the early 1900s. The cuneiform was deciphered later. A great empire had been hiding under farmland the entire time, waiting for the right shovel. Burned cities. Between roughly 5400 and 2700 before the Common Era, an enormous network of settlements covered what is now parts of Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania. The Cucuteni Tripilia culture, named for the modern villages near which the first sites were discovered, built some of the largest human settlements anywhere in the world at the time. Cities like Talianki and Majdanetsky may have housed 10 to 20,000 people, with planned street grids, painted pottery, and clay figurines that hint at a rich symbolic life. Their most extraordinary habit was the periodic burning of their own cities. Every 60 to 80 years, the inhabitants of a Cucuteni Tripilia settlement would set the houses on fire. The wooden structures collapsed, baking the clay walls into solid ceramic mounds. The people then built a new town nearby, repeated the cycle, and burned that one too in due time. Over thousands of years, the pattern was followed across the region with remarkable consistency. Nobody knows why. Ritual renewal, sanitation, soil exhaustion, marriage rules tied to inheritance, even insect infestation have all been proposed. Whatever the reason, the burning was a planned act of communal destruction, repeated for hundreds of generations. The culture itself ended around 2700 before the Common Era. The cities were abandoned, not rebuilt, and the people seem to have dissolved into other populations across the surrounding regions, possibly displaced by the arrival of new groups from the steppes. They left behind millions of pottery shards, no writing, no clear successor, and the puzzle of a civilization that, for millennia, regularly set fire to itself. Vanished keepers. In December of 1900, a passing steamer reported that the lighthouse on Island Moor, in the remote Flannan Isles off the west coast of Scotland, was not lit. A relief vessel arrived a few days later. The three keepers, James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, were gone. The lighthouse itself was undisturbed. The kitchen was tidy. One of the keepers' oilskin coats was missing, suggesting two of them had gone outside in stormy weather, while the third had not bothered with foul weather gear, perhaps because he was leaving in a hurry. The official log told a partial story. The last entries described severe weather, A subsequent note recorded the storm passing. There was no entry explaining the disappearance. The men had simply stopped writing. Footprints, marks, and storm damage near the western landing showed that one of the heavy iron mooring rings had been ripped out by waves and that the cliff edge had been battered by water, rising far higher than expected. The most accepted explanation is that all three keepers went down to secure equipment during a freak wave and were swept off the rocks together. Even that explanation is incomplete. The position of the missing coat, the disorder at the western landing, and the timing of the storm references in the log have given rise to a century of speculation. Madness, murder, abduction by ghosts, and even visiting submarines have all been suggested. No bodies were ever recovered. What remains is a stone tower on an empty rock, the calm interior, and three men whose disappearance is one of the better documented absences in modern Scottish history. They had a routine, a logbook, and a job to do. One day, the routine simply stopped. Ghost ship. On the 5th of December in 1872, the British brigantine Dei Gratia, sailing across the Atlantic, spotted another ship moving erratically about 400 miles east of the Azores. It was the American merchant ship Mary Celeste, last seen leaving New York Harbor nearly a month earlier. The Dei Gratia's crew boarded her and found something almost impossible. The ship was empty. The crew, the captain, his wife, and their 2-year-old daughter, 10 people in all, were gone. The state of the ship deepened the mystery. The cargo of denatured alcohol was largely intact. The personal possessions, including valuables and a half-eaten meal, had been left behind. The lifeboat was missing. The ship was seaworthy, though one of her pumps had been disassembled and one sail was damaged. Her last log entry, written 9 days before the discovery, gave a position several hundred miles to the west. The crew had simply abandoned a working ship in the middle of the Atlantic. Theories have multiplied since. The most plausible suggests that fumes from the leaking alcohol cargo frightened the captain into ordering the crew off the ship in the lifeboat, perhaps with the intention of returning. A sudden squall may have separated the lifeboat from the ship, leaving the survivors to drift while the Mary Celeste sailed away under reduced canvas. Other proposals include mutiny, pirate attack, and an explosion that did not damage the cargo holds. No theory has produced bodies, lifeboat wreckage, or survivor accounts. The Mary Celeste herself was sold, refitted, and continued sailing under new owners for another 12 years. Her 10 missing passengers remain, in a strict and statistical sense, still missing. Ancient computer. In 1901, sponge divers off the small Greek island of Antikythera discovered the wreck of an ancient Roman cargo ship. Among the bronze statues and amphorae they recovered was a corroded lump of metal that did not look like anything else in the cargo. Decades of careful study revealed that it was a complex geared device dating from around the 1st century before the Common Era, made of more than 30 interlocking bronze gears. Modern researchers call it the Antikythera mechanism. The device was a portable astronomical computer. By turning a hand crank, the user could read off the positions of the Sun, the Moon, and the 5 planets known to ancient astronomers, the dates of upcoming eclipses, the timing of various ancient festivals, and even the date of the next Olympic Games. The level of mechanical sophistication required to build it was so advanced that for over a millennium after its construction, nothing comparable appears anywhere in the surviving record. What is most striking is how completely the technology disappeared. The mechanism was a finished, polished product, not a one-off prototype. It implies a workshop tradition, a chain of teachers and apprentices, and probably other similar devices. Yet no other example, no surviving design, no clear textual description has ever been found. The next devices of similar complexity, the clockwork astronomical instruments of medieval Europe, appear roughly 1400 years later. The lone surviving example, recovered from the seabed by divers who had no idea what they were holding, hints at an entire lost tradition of precision engineering. Somewhere between the workshop that built it and the modern museums that now display it, the chain broke. The Greeks knew how to do this once. The world forgot. Forgotten cities. Around 2600 before the Common Era, in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, a remarkable urban culture flowered along the Indus River. Cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro housed tens of thousands of people in planned street grids, with standardized brick sizes, sophisticated drainage, public baths, and uniform weights and measures used over an area larger than ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. The civilization traded with the Persian Gulf and beyond. It produced delicate seals carved with animals and a still undeciphered script. By around 1900 before the Common Era, the great cities had been abandoned. The unified standards faded. The urban network broke up into smaller scattered settlements. People did not vanish from the region. The population dispersed eastward and southward and contributed to later cultures of the subcontinent. But the integrated civilization, with its planned cities and shared symbols, simply stopped operating. The cause is still debated. Long-term climate change weakened the seasonal rains that fed the agriculture. The Sarasvati River, once a major waterway, dried up. Tectonic shifts may have altered the course of the Indus itself, flooding some cities and stranding others. Trade with Mesopotamia dwindled. The complex urban system, dependent on stable water and stable trade, lost the conditions that allowed it to function. What is most striking is the silence. Unlike the Egyptians or the Mesopotamians, the Indus people left no readable record of their politics, their religion, or their language. The script on their seals is among the most studied, undeciphered systems in archaeology, with no breakthrough yet. A civilization that may have included 1 million people-built cities, traded across thousands of miles, and faded away while leaving almost nothing the modern reader can quote them as saying. Sahara civilization. In what is now southern Libya, between roughly 1000 before the Common Era and around the year 700, the Garamantes built a sophisticated civilization in the heart of the Central Sahara. They lived in fortified mud brick towns. They herded livestock and grew crops, including wheat, barley, dates, and grapes, in a region that today is barely habitable. They traded with Roman cities to the north and with sub-Saharan kingdoms to the south. At their height, they were a regional power that Imperial Rome treated with serious respect. Their key achievement was hydraulic engineering. They tapped fossil groundwater, ancient water trapped underground from wetter geological eras, by digging long tunnels called foggeras that drained the water by gravity into their fields. Some of these tunnels ran for miles underground. The Garamantes used this water to maintain agriculture in an environment that, by the standards of their time and ours, should have been impossible to farm. The vulnerability of the system was the source of the water itself. Fossil aquifers do not refill on human timescales. As the Garamantes drained them, the water table dropped. New tunnels had to be dug deeper. Maintenance grew more expensive. Around the 8th century, the entire system reached the limits of what fossil water could supply. The towns withered, the population dispersed or died. The Saharan civilization effectively ended. The lesson is striking. The Garamantes did not fall to invasion or plague. They simply used up the water that had been their entire foundation. By the time European geographers began mapping the Central Sahara in any detail, the towns were sand-drifted ruins and the tunnels were dry. A civilization that had stood for over 1,000 years had quietly drunk itself out of existence. Unread script. Linear A is one of 2 related scripts used on the island of Crete during the Bronze Age. The other, Linear B, was deciphered in the 1950s by Michael Ventris and shown to be an early form of Greek. Linear A is older, dating from around 1800 to 1450 before the Common Era, and was used by the Minoan civilization that flourished on the island before the Mycenaean takeover. Linear A appears on clay tablets, on small pieces of pottery, on stone offering tables, and on metal objects. Despite more than a century of study, Linear A has resisted decipherment. Researchers can identify many of its signs and even guess the phonetic values of some of them by comparison with the related linear B. The problem is that the underlying language is not known. The Minoans spoke something that is not clearly related to any later language family. Without a Rosetta Stone equivalent, the meaning of the inscriptions remains out of reach. About 1,500 surviving inscriptions are known, most of them short, many of them apparently administrative. They probably record offerings, lists of goods, names, and quantities. The fuller content of Minoan literary, religious, or political writing, if any existed, has not been recovered. Whatever the Minoans wrote about themselves, the modern reader cannot follow. When the Mycenaeans took over Crete around 1450 before the Common Era, they adapted some linear A signs to write Greek, producing linear B. The Minoan language went silent and the linear A script went out of use. A literate civilization with a writing system used for centuries left behind only enough text to confirm that it could write, not enough for anyone after to learn what it said. Mystery broadcasts. For decades, shortwave radio listeners around the world have come across odd transmissions. A flat synthetic voice, or sometimes a child's voice, reads out a sequence of digits in a steady cadence, often in Spanish, German, English, Korean, or Russian. The transmissions follow a regular schedule. They are preceded by recognizable opening tunes, like the cheerful melody of a station nicknamed the Lincolnshire Poacher. They serve no obvious commercial purpose. Anyone with a receiver can listen. The function of these so-called numbers stations is widely understood, even if it is not officially confirmed. They are thought to be one-way communications from intelligence agencies to field operatives. A spy in a foreign country needs no special hardware to receive a shortwave broadcast and no traceable contact with the home agency. With a one-time pad, a printed key that the spy carries, the meaningless-seeming digits can be turned into specific instructions. The technique has been in use since the early years of the Cold War. Officially, no government has acknowledged operating one. Stations have been tracked by amateur listeners to broadcast sites in Russia, the United States, Britain, Cuba, China, and several other countries. Some stations have run for 50 years or more. Others appear, transmit for a while, and quietly stop. The voices, the schedules, the call signs, all of it is recorded by hobbyists, analysed in online forums, archived for decades, and never publicly explained by the people sending them. The strangest aspect is the survival of the practice in the internet age. Encrypted online communication is much harder to intercept than open shortwave broadcasts. Yet the stations carry on, often with audible upgrades, perhaps because the underlying logic of safe one-way contact has not changed. Voices keep reading numbers into the empty air. The audience that needs them remains, in public, unnamed. The Skyjacker. On the day before Thanksgiving in 1971, a man calling himself Dan Cooper boarded a Northwest Orient Airlines flight from Portland to Seattle in the United States. He was quiet, polite, wearing a dark suit and a clip-on tie. After takeoff, he handed a stewardess a note. He claimed to have a bomb in his briefcase and demanded $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. The plane landed in Seattle. The passengers were released. The money and parachutes were delivered. After refueling, Cooper ordered the plane to take off again, southbound toward Mexico City at low altitude. Somewhere over the wooded hills of southwestern Washington, he lowered the rear stairs of the Boeing aircraft, strapped on a parachute, and jumped out into the rain and darkness. The plane landed safely. Cooper, the cash, and the parachute were gone. He was never reliably identified, never traced, and no body was ever recovered from the supposed jump zone. In 1980, a young boy found a bundle of decaying currency along the Columbia River. The serial numbers matched the ransom. That single fragment is the only physical trace of the cash that ever surfaced. The rest of the money, the parachute, and the man himself have not appeared in nearly 50 years of investigation. The FBI formally closed the case in 2016 without naming a suspect. D.B. Cooper is the only unsolved aircraft hijacking in the history of American commercial aviation. Various candidates have been proposed, including a string of obsessive amateur theories. None has produced enough evidence to count as a solution. A man in a dark suit walked onto a plane, walked into the sky, and walked out of the historical record. Empty cliffs. Across the high desert of the American Southwest, in the canyons of what is now Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona, the ancestral Puebloan people, often called the Anasazi, built remarkable stone settlements. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, and Canyon de Chelly sit tucked into rock alcoves hundreds of feet above the valley floors, with kivas, towers, and tightly fitted masonry that survives largely intact today. At their height, between roughly the year 900 and 1275, the Anasazi were one of the most sophisticated cultures in North America. Within about a generation, in the late 1200s, the cliff dwellings were emptied. The people did not all die. They migrated south and east, where they became the ancestors of the modern Pueblo nations of New Mexico and Arizona, including the Hopi, Zuni, and Acoma, but the specific settlements they had built into the cliffs were left intact. Granaries with corn still inside, pottery on the floors, sandals by the doorways, whole towns walked away. The cause is not a single event. Tree ring records show that a long and severe drought struck the region in the late 1200s. Soil exhaustion, social conflict, religious change, and pressure from incoming peoples have all been proposed as contributing forces. The combination probably made the cliff dwellings, with their dependence on rain-fed agriculture, untenable. What is striking is the deliberate quality of the abandonment. The Anasazi did not flee in panic. They sealed off kivas. They left ritual offerings. They closed doorways. The settlements were not destroyed by attack. They were retired, gently, by people who knew they were not coming back. The empty rooms above the valleys still wait, in a sense, for residents who chose to walk away. Lost flocks. In the 1800s, the passenger pigeon was almost certainly the most abundant bird species in North America. Flocks were so vast, they darkened the sky for hours as they passed overhead. Naturalists estimated the total population at between 3 and 5 billion individuals, possibly more than all other North American birds combined. Roosting flocks broke tree limbs under their weight. They were a fact of the continent, like rivers and weather. By the early 1900s, they were nearly gone. Industrial scale hunting, fueled by railroad shipment of carcasses to urban meat markets, killed birds at staggering rates. Nesting colonies were systematically targeted. Forest clearance destroyed habitat. The flocks, which depended on enormous numbers to breed successfully, dropped below a threshold from which they could not recover. The last known wild passenger pigeon was shot in 1901. The last captive bird, a female named Martha, died in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1914. What makes the case strange is the speed. Many species decline over centuries. The passenger pigeon, the most abundant bird in North America, went functionally extinct in roughly 50 years. The scale of loss is hard to picture. A population larger than that of any modern bird on the continent disappeared inside a single human lifespan. The ecological consequences are still being studied. The pigeons consumed enormous quantities of nuts, particularly acorns and beechmast, shaping the composition of eastern forests. Their disappearance may have changed which trees dominate in those forests today. Their absence is structural, in other words, not just emotional. A sky once filled with them is now empty in a way the species never witnessed. Mystery hum. Near the town of Taos, in the high desert of northern New Mexico, a small but persistent minority of residents report hearing a low, droning sound somewhere at the threshold of audibility. They describe it as similar to a distant diesel engine or to a refrigerator running in another room. The hum is constant. It seems to come from nowhere in particular. It is heard mostly indoors and at night, but not by everyone. Estimates from local surveys suggest that about 2% of the population can detect it. Investigators have tried for decades to identify the source. Specialized microphones, ground vibration sensors, and electromagnetic detectors have been deployed in the area. No clear external signal has been pinned down. Some studies have noted that hum hearers tend to share similar age ranges or hearing profiles. Other studies have failed to confirm any specific physical explanation. The hum is reported in a few dozen other regions around the world, with apparent similarities, suggesting it may be a more general phenomenon than a single location-bound mystery. Proposed explanations include otoacoustic emissions, in which the ear itself generates faint sounds that some individuals can detect. Other suggestions point to industrial sources, low-frequency radio waves, military communications, or even the resonance of distant ocean waves transmitted through the ground. None has been confirmed. What makes the Tao's hum strange is that the people who hear it are not imagining anything obviously wrong. They are mostly otherwise healthy. They describe the sound consistently. They sometimes lose sleep over it. And the people next to them, sometimes their own family members, hear nothing at all. The sound, if there is a sound, is present and absent at the same time, depending on the listener. Lost recipe. Many ancient Roman structures, including the dome of the Pantheon, the piers of harbours along the Mediterranean, and parts of the Colosseum, are made of a concrete that has outlasted nearly every modern alternative. The Pantheon dome, cast nearly 2,000 years ago, remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome on Earth. Roman harbour concrete sat continuously in seawater for centuries without crumbling, while modern concrete piers begin to degrade within decades. The Romans built with this material for centuries, then lost the recipe. The knowledge faded as the Western Empire collapsed, and as the demand for monumental construction dropped. Skilled mortar mixers, who would have known the proportions and the source of the materials, died or scattered. By the medieval period, European builders had reverted to weaker mortar formulas. The Roman recipe was effectively forgotten for over 1,000 years. Modern researchers have only recently begun to understand what the Romans were doing. The key ingredient was volcanic ash, particularly from the region around Pozzuoli in Italy, mixed with lime and seawater. The chemical reactions between the seawater and the volcanic minerals produced rare crystals that filled cracks in the concrete as they formed, allowing the material to repair itself over centuries. Roman concrete does not just resist weathering. In some cases, it grows stronger over time. The full formula has been reconstructed within the last few decades. Researchers can now produce concrete that mimics some of the Roman properties. But the original chain of practical knowledge, the daily work of mixing and pouring on Roman building sites, was broken when the empire fell. A construction technology used by millions of people for hundreds of years was lost so thoroughly that the world had to rediscover it from the rubble of the buildings themselves. Siberian blast. On the morning of the 30th of June in 1908, an enormous explosion occurred above a remote area of Siberia near the Tunguska River. The blast flattened an estimated 80 million trees over an area of more than 2,000 square kilometers. The shockwave knocked people off their feet hundreds of kilometers away. Glowing skies were reported across Europe for days afterward, possibly the result of dust thrown into the upper atmosphere. What makes the event unusual is that no clear impact crater was ever found. The trees nearest the center of the blast were stripped of their branches, but left standing upright, suggesting a downward force rather than a sideways one. Whatever caused the explosion did so above the ground, not on it. Modern estimates put the energy of the blast at the equivalent of 10 to 15 megatons of TNT, hundreds of times the force of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The first scientific expedition reached the site in 1927, almost 20 years after the event. By that time, the soft ground had absorbed many traces. The investigators found the radial pattern of flattened trees but no obvious meteorite fragments. Later expeditions recovered microscopic glassy particles consistent with an extraterrestrial body, supporting the theory that a small asteroid or comet had exploded in the atmosphere through what scientists now call an airburst. Even so, the lack of a recoverable impact body has kept the case partly open. A large stony or icy object would have shattered high in the atmosphere. The energy is consistent with such an event. The exact composition of the object that caused the largest known impact in modern human history, however, remains an inference rather than a fact. Whatever it was, it arrived, leveled a forest, and vanished into vapor before anyone could examine it. Deep sound. In the summer of 1997, hydrophones run by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, originally designed to detect Soviet submarines during the Cold War, picked up an extraordinary sound from somewhere in the South Pacific. The signal was an ultra-low frequency rumble, audible across sensors more than 5,000 kilometers apart. It was louder than any whale call ever recorded. It rose and fell over about a minute, then ended. The researchers nicknamed it the bloop. For more than a decade, the sound was unexplained. Speculation ranged from secret naval activity to enormous unknown marine animals. The size implied by the volume would have meant a creature far larger than any known whale, which fed the imaginations of cryptozoology enthusiasts for years. The bloop, in the absence of an answer, became a small star of internet folklore. In 2012, NOAA released a more sober explanation. By comparing the bloop to similar signals recorded later, scientists concluded that it was almost certainly the sound of a large iceberg cracking or scraping the seabed as it broke apart. Iceberg-related sounds in subsequent recordings showed the same overall shape and frequency. The bloop in this view was an ice quake. The official explanation has not been universally accepted. Some researchers note that the original bloop was even louder than recorded ice quakes, suggesting either an unusually large event or some additional factor. The sound itself, in any case, is gone. The iceberg, if it was an iceberg, has long since melted. Whatever made the loudest noise ever recorded underwater can no longer be brought back for a second listen. American metropolis. In the river bottoms east of modern St. Louis, in the United States, sits the remains of a city that almost no one has heard of. Cahokia, the center of the Mississippian culture, peaked around the year 1100. At its height, it covered more than 15 square kilometers and may have housed 20 to 40,000 people, larger than London at the same date. It included a central plaza, dozens of earthen mounds up to 30 meters tall, planned residential districts, a wooden solar calendar called Woodhenge, and a regional trade network reaching the Gulf of Mexico and the Rocky Mountains. Within about 2 centuries, Cahokia was empty. By 1350, the city had been abandoned. The descendants of its people scattered across the Mississippi Valley and contributed to many of the later native nations of the southeast. The earthen mounds remained, slowly returning to grass and forest until European arrivals in the 18th century mistook them for natural hills. The cause of the abandonment is still debated. Climate shifts, including a long cooling and drying period, are well documented in the regional record. Soil exhaustion from intensive corn agriculture, deforestation, flooding of the lowlands, and internal conflict among rival lineages have all been proposed. The combination probably overwhelmed a city dependent on a particular set of conditions. Cahokia is unsettling for a different reason as well. It was forgotten so thoroughly by later cultures that, when European settlers found the mounds, many refused to believe Native Americans had built them at all. Pseudo-historical theories about lost white races persisted into the 20th century. A genuine indigenous metropolis had been erased from popular memory in 2 waves, first by its own end and then by the prejudices of those who arrived later. Maya collapse. For nearly 6 centuries, between roughly the years 200 and 900, the Maya cities of the southern lowlands of what is now Guatemala, Belize, southern Mexico, and Honduras formed one of the most sophisticated cultures of the ancient Americas. They built stepped stone pyramids, developed a complex written language, tracked astronomical cycles with extraordinary precision, and ran a regional system of competing city-states with kings, courts, and ceremonial centers. Then, in the 9th century, large parts of the system collapsed. One by one, the great cities of the southern lowlands, including Tikal, Palenque, and Copan, stopped erecting new monuments, construction halted, royal inscriptions ceased, populations fell drastically, in some areas by more than 90%. The cities were not destroyed. They were left, like the Anasazi cliff dwellings, intact but empty. Within a few generations, the jungle began to take them back. The cause is not a single event. Drought records from cave deposits and lake sediments show a long sequence of unusually dry years during the collapse. Soil erosion from intensive agriculture made farming harder. Warfare between city-states intensified, recorded in the same monuments that soon stopped being made. Political legitimacy, which depended on the king's claimed ability to control rainfall and harvests, was undermined by ecological failure. What survives is striking. Maya civilization did not entirely end. Cities in the northern Yucatan continued for centuries afterward, and the Maya people remain in the millions today. But the specific classic system, with its tall southern cities and god-kings, simply walked away from its monuments. The pyramids that astronauts can pick out from orbit, half buried in green, were abandoned in plain sight by the people who had built them. Angkor. In what is now northwestern Cambodia, the Khmer Empire built a sprawling capital around stone temples like Angkor Wat and Angkor Thom. At its height between the 11th and 15th centuries, the urban complex covered nearly 1,000 square kilometers, supported by a vast network of canals, reservoirs, and rice fields. Estimates of the population range from several hundred thousand to nearly 1 million. Angkor was probably the largest pre-industrial city on Earth. By the 15th century, the capital was nearly empty. The royal court moved south to Phnom Penh. The temple complexes were partly abandoned to the forest. The intricate water system that had supported the city was no longer maintained. By the time European missionaries first arrived in the 16th century, much of Angkor was overgrown ruin, with locals still using a few of the temples for worship. The causes are still debated by modern researchers. A combination of climate variability, including long droughts followed by destructive floods, damaged the irrigation system. The complexity of the water network meant that once a few key elements failed, the rest cascaded. Pressure from neighbouring kingdoms, particularly the Ayutthaya Kingdom of Thailand, added military stress. The shift of trade routes toward the coast made an inland capital less useful. Angkor was never entirely forgotten by the Khmer people, who knew the ruins were there. But the elaborate hydraulic and political system that had supported 1 million people in the rainforest was lost. The greatest pre-industrial city the world has yet produced was left to be slowly swallowed by jungle, while a few monks continued to light candles in its empty halls. Ghost humans. In a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia in 2008, archaeologists found a tiny fragment of a finger bone. Genetic analysis a few years later produced a startling result. The bone belonged to a previously unknown branch of the human family, distinct from both modern humans and Neanderthals, that had branched off from a common ancestor about 500,000 years ago. The new group was named the Denisovans, after Denisova Cave where the bone was found. In the years since, only a handful of additional Denisovan remains have been identified: a few teeth, a piece of skull, a jawbone from the Tibetan Plateau. Almost everything else known about the species has been reconstructed from DNA alone. Their genome shows that they interbred with both Neanderthals and modern humans. Their descendants live today. Modern populations across Southeast Asia, Melanesia, and Australia carry several percent Denisovan ancestry. Some Tibetans owe their ability to live at high altitude to a Denisovan inherited gene. What is uncanny is how thinly they are represented in the physical record. They lived across much of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They interacted with multiple human species. They contributed crucial adaptations to surviving populations. Yet the entire fossil collection of their bodies could fit on a small table. Almost everything known about their faces, their tools, and their daily lives is inference. The Denisovans, in the standard sense of disappearance, are gone. They blended into other lineages and faded as a distinct group, but they also disappeared in a stranger way. They lived right up to the edge of recorded history without leaving a body to introduce themselves with. We know them mostly as ghosts inside our own genome. First writing. Around 3200 before the Common Era, in what is now southwestern Iran, the civilization of Elam developed one of the world's earliest writing systems. The script, known to modern scholars as Proto-Elamite, was used on clay tablets for several centuries to record administrative information. About 1,600 Proto-Elamite tablets have been recovered, most of them from the city of Susa, with shorter inscriptions found at other sites. Despite more than a century of effort, the script has resisted decipherment. Researchers can identify some of its numerical signs and a few categories of pictographic symbols, but the underlying language remains uncertain and the grammatical structure largely opaque. The tablets are mostly economic, recording quantities of grain, livestock and other goods, but the specific words for these goods, the verbs, and the names cannot be reliably read. The script appears to have evolved into a later one, called Linear Elamite, which is also poorly understood, and eventually gave way to cuneiform borrowed from neighbouring Mesopotamia. The original Proto-Elamite system was used by enough people across enough sites to be recognisable, then quietly abandoned. With it went any chance of recovering the early voice of the Elamite civilization in its own words. Among ancient scripts, Proto-Elamite holds a particular place. It is roughly contemporaneous with the earliest Sumerian writing. It may have been developed independently or under Sumerian influence. Either way, it was a complete administrative tool used by a major culture for centuries, and it remains today the oldest substantial undeciphered script in the world. Lost Library. Founded in the early 3rd century before the Common Era under the early Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt, the Library of Alexandria was the largest collection of texts in the ancient Mediterranean world. Scholars estimate it may have held between 40,000 and several 100,000 scrolls, depending on the source and the era. It attracted some of the greatest minds of antiquity, including Euclid, Eratosthenes, and Hypatia, who came to read, copy, and write in its halls. The library's destruction is murkier than the popular story. There was no single dramatic fire. Instead, a long sequence of disasters slowly eroded the collection. Julius Caesar accidentally set fire to part of the docks in 48 before the Common Era, possibly damaging some scrolls. Civil unrest, religious conflicts, and the slow decline of imperial Egypt over several centuries took their toll. By the time of the Muslim conquest in the 7th century, the original library was almost certainly already gone, though later legends attached its end to that conquest as well. What was lost matters more than how it was lost. Many works of ancient mathematics, science, literature, and history that we know existed by reference are missing today. Plays by Aeschylus and Sophocles, lost dialogues by Aristotle, whole branches of Greek poetry, astronomical observations that would extend our records by centuries. The library's contents shape not just what was known, but what could be remembered. What remains is mostly absence. Modern scholarship can sometimes reconstruct fragments from quotations in surviving authors, but the central reservoir, the working memory of the classical Mediterranean, slipped away over centuries. The most famous library in history is famous in part because its loss left a hole still visible in everything that came after. Cosmic signals. In 2007, astronomers reviewing old data from the Parkes Radio Telescope in Australia noticed something odd. A single bright pulse of radio energy, lasting only a few thousandths of a second, had been recorded in 2001. The signal showed clear marks of having travelled enormous distances through space. The source seemed to be from billions of light-years away. Researchers called these events fast radio bursts, often shortened to FRBs. Since then, hundreds of FRBs have been catalogued by multiple radio telescopes. They appear without warning, last a fraction of a second, and release energy comparable to what the sun emits over months or years, all concentrated in a single radio flash. Most are one-offs. A few have repeated, which has allowed astronomers to trace their origins to specific distant galaxies, sometimes to particular regions inside those galaxies. The cause remains debated. Magnetars, a type of neutron star with an extremely strong magnetic field, are the leading candidate. Other proposals involve mergers of compact objects, exotic forms of stellar collapse, or processes not yet identified. The diversity of FRB properties, including bursts that repeat at regular intervals and bursts that flash once and never again, makes it likely that more than one mechanism is involved. What is striking is how new the puzzle is. Astronomers had been recording the radio sky for half a century before fast radio bursts were noticed. They arrive constantly, possibly thousands per day across the whole sky. They release astonishing energies, and until recently, we did not know they existed at all. Whatever is causing them has been pulsing across the universe the entire time we have been watching, mostly unseen. Sunken ruins. Off the coast of Yonaguni Island, at the far western end of the Japanese archipelago, lies a strange undersea formation. At a depth of around 25 meters, divers have documented a series of flat terraces, sharp corners, parallel walls, and step-like surfaces stretching over an area roughly the size of a city block. The structure was first reported in 1986 by a local diver looking for shark observation spots. Since then, it has drawn the attention of both geologists and amateur enthusiasts of lost civilizations. The central debate is whether the monument is natural or artificial. Geologists who have studied it argue that the formation is consistent with the natural cleavage of the local sandstone, which tends to break along straight lines and right angles. The terraces can be explained by erosion along bedding planes. By this view, the Yonaguni monument is an unusually photogenic example of ordinary marine geology. A minority of researchers, including the Japanese marine geologist Masaki Kimura, have argued that some features, including what they interpret as carved faces, drainage channels, and tool marks, are too regular to be natural. If the structure is artificial, it would have to have been carved before the end of the last ice age, when the area was above sea level more than 10,000 years ago. That would make it older than any other known megalithic monument by several thousand years. The disagreement has not been resolved. Underwater excavation is difficult. The structure sits in strong currents and shifting sediment. Whatever it is, it represents a quiet kind of disappearance. Either a natural marvel hides among shapes that look uncannily like construction, or an ancient builder hides under thousands of years of seawater. The boundary between the two has not been firmly drawn. Lost Vikings. Around the year 985, the Norse explorer Eric the Red led a small fleet of ships from Iceland to settle two areas on the southwestern coast of Greenland. The settlements grew over the centuries, eventually housing several thousand people, with churches, farms, a bishopric, and regular trade contact with Norway. The Norse Greenlanders raised cattle and sheep, hunted seal and walrus, and exported walrus ivory and polar bear skins to Europe. By the middle of the 15th century, the settlements were gone. The eastern settlement, the larger of the two, had its last documented contact with Europe in 1408. By the time a Danish-Norwegian expedition arrived in the early 1700s to check on its lost colonists, there was nothing left but ruins and graves. The Norse Greenlanders had died out or moved on. No survivor account was ever produced. The causes are still being argued. The Little Ice Age cooled the climate during the late medieval period, making farming harder and pack ice more dangerous for shipping. The market for walrus ivory collapsed when African elephant ivory became cheaper and more available. The Black Death may have devastated the population. The Norse may have failed to adapt to the deteriorating conditions in ways that the local Thule Inuit, with their seal hunting technology, did successfully. What is most striking is the silence. The Greenland Norse were literate, Christian, in regular contact with Norway, and well documented in church records for centuries. Their end is almost entirely undocumented. The lights went out, settlement by settlement, across a generation, while the rest of Europe was busy with the early Renaissance. The first European colony in the Western Hemisphere disappeared without a written goodbye. Underground city. In the Cappadocia region of central Turkey, the soft volcanic stone allows for relatively easy excavation. Local people have carved into the rock for thousands of years, producing cave churches, hermitages, and storage rooms. But one site, the underground city of Derinkuyu, stands apart in scale. The complex descends at least 18 levels underground, reaching depths of around 85 meters. It includes living quarters, kitchens, stables, churches, wineries, wells, ventilation shafts, and heavy stone rolling doors that could seal off entire sections. Estimates suggest Derinkuyu could house as many as 20,000 people for extended periods. It dates at least to the Phrygian era in the 8th century before the Common Era and may have older roots. Various populations used and expanded it over the centuries, including early Christians hiding from Roman and later Arab raids. The city was clearly designed as a refuge, a place where an entire community could disappear beneath the surface during periods of danger and emerge later when conditions allowed. What is remarkable is that the city was completely forgotten. By the modern era, even local memory of its full extent had faded. The site was rediscovered, almost by accident, in 1963 when a Turkish man, knocking down a wall in his basement, uncovered a passage leading into a previously unknown room. Subsequent exploration revealed the full scale of the underground city beneath his house. Derinkuyu is not the only such site in Cappadocia. Dozens of underground cities and refuges have since been mapped. Many are still being uncovered. An entire architectural tradition used for protection by generations of people slipped out of common knowledge until a homeowner happened to break through the wrong wall. The largest of these hidden cities had been sitting beneath everyday life for centuries. The Hobbit. In 2003, archaeologists working in Liang Bua cave on the Indonesian island of Flores uncovered a skeleton that did not match any known human species. The individual stood about 1 meter tall, had a brain about the size of a chimpanzee's, and showed a mixture of primitive and modern features. Additional remains, eventually representing at least 9 individuals, were recovered. The team identified the find as a new species, Homo floresiensis, quickly nicknamed the Hobbit. The most startling aspect was the age. The bones initially dated to as recent as 12,000 years ago. Later refinements pushed the most recent confirmed remains back to about 50,000 years ago. But even that is shockingly recent. Modern humans were already in the region. The hobbits, on their isolated island, persisted alongside Homo sapiens for tens of thousands of years before disappearing. Their origin is unclear. They may descend from an early dispersal of Homo erectus that became isolated on Flores and shrank under the evolutionary pressure of island life, a phenomenon called insular dwarfism. They may instead descend from an even earlier and more primitive hominin lineage. Either possibility implies that the human family tree was bushier and stranger than anyone suspected before the discovery. What makes this disappearance unsettling is the timing. A separate species of human, smaller than us, lived on a populated island until the recent past. They made tools, they hunted small elephants, they presumably had their own social lives. They then ended, leaving a single cave deposit and a handful of bones to introduce themselves to the modern world. The picture of recent human history has been quietly redrawn by people we never knew were on the page. Skeleton Lake. In the Indian state of Uttarakhand, at an elevation of over 5,000 meters in the Himalayan foothills, sits a small glacial lake called Rupkund. For most of the year it is frozen. During the brief summer thaw, the water level drops and the lake bed reveals what local shepherds have known about for centuries. The bottom and the surrounding ice are scattered with human skeletons. Estimates put the total at several hundred individuals. The lake was brought to wider attention in 1942 when a British forest ranger reported the find. Early investigators assumed the remains were victims of a military expedition or a recent disaster. Radiocarbon dating in the early 2000s instead placed most of the bones at around the 9th century. The dead had been lying in or beside the lake for over 1,000 years. Genetic analysis added a stranger layer to the story. The skeletons were not from a single population. One cluster was indigenous to South Asia, consistent with locals. Another, smaller cluster showed Eastern Mediterranean ancestry, plausibly from the region around modern Greece or Crete. They were not contemporaries. The Mediterranean group lay at the lake roughly 1,000 years after the South Asian one. Two separate disasters, separated by centuries, had left their dead in the same spot. What killed them is partly explained by the bones themselves. Many of the skulls show deep impact fractures consistent with blows from large round objects, probably hailstones, of the kind that giant Himalayan storms can produce. The leading theory is that pilgrim groups or travelling parties were caught in sudden high-altitude hailstorms and killed where they stood. Why two such events happened at the same anonymous lake, separated by a millennium, remains an open question. Lost papers. Nikola Tesla, the Serbian-American inventor of alternating current systems and many of the foundations of modern electrical engineering, died alone in a New York hotel room in January of 1943. He was 86 and largely forgotten by the public. Within hours of his death, agents of the United States government, including representatives of the Office of Alien Property, entered his rooms and confiscated everything in his possession. Notebooks, blueprints, models, personal correspondence, and unpublished manuscripts were boxed up and removed. The reason was wartime caution. Tesla had spent his later years working on energy transmission, radio-guided weapons, and other ideas with possible military applications. With the country at war, American officials wanted to be certain that none of his work would fall into enemy hands. The papers were turned over to the FBI and to a young physicist named John G. Trump, who reviewed them and concluded that most of Tesla's late ideas were speculative or unrealized. Much of the material was eventually released to Tesla's nephew and family, who deposited the bulk of it in the Nikola Tesla Museum in Belgrade, but significant portions remained classified or simply disappeared from the documented chain of custody. The full inventory of what was originally taken has never been published. Researchers who later requested files under the Freedom of Information Act received heavily redacted documents and references to materials that could not be located. What was actually missing has been the subject of decades of speculation, much of it credulous. Tesla's late ideas, including a death ray, a particle beam weapon, and free energy transmission, were almost certainly more theoretical than the breathless rumors suggest. But the official secrecy around the papers and the gaps in the released record have ensured that the question of what exactly the government took and what they kept will probably never be fully answered. Lost parrot. The Carolina parakeet was a small, vibrantly coloured bird with a green body, yellow head, and an orange face. It ranged across the eastern half of what is now the United States, from the Gulf Coast to the upper Midwest. It lived in noisy flocks of dozens or hundreds, nested in tree hollows, and fed on the seeds of cypress, beech, and other native trees. It was the only parrot species native to a region as far north as the Great Lakes anywhere in the Americas. By the early 20th century, it was extinct. The last confirmed wild specimens were shot in Florida around the year 1904. The last captive bird, a male named Incas, died in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1918, in the same cage that the last passenger pigeon had died in 4 years earlier. The species had disappeared, in human terms, within a generation. The exact causes are not fully understood. Habitat destruction, particularly the clearance of old-growth bottomland forests, removed nesting sites. Hunting was relentless, partly because farmers considered the birds pests on orchards and grain fields, partly because their bright feathers were valued for women's hats. The flocks had the unfortunate habit of returning to the bodies of fallen members, which made them especially easy to wipe out in a single afternoon by hunters with shotguns. Introduced diseases from European poultry may have played a role. What is striking is the silence that followed. Before the bird vanished, eastern forests rang with the sound of green flocks. Naturalists, including John James Audubon, painted them in detail. After the loss, an entire layer of sound and colour was simply gone from the canopy. The species that had brightened American forests for tens of thousands of years left behind a few museum skins, several paintings, and an empty sky. Lost plays. William Shakespeare, the central figure of English literature, wrote at least 37 plays that survive in some form. The collected works, gathered after his death in the famous First Folio of 1623, preserved most of his canon. But documentary references and contemporary records make clear that at least 2 and possibly more of his plays no longer exist as full texts. They are known only by title or by brief description. The most prominent of the lost works is a play called Cardenio. Records show it was performed at court in 1613 and that Shakespeare collaborated with John Fletcher on its writing. The plot, based on an episode in Don Quixote, was widely known at the time. The text itself has disappeared. A later 18th century adaptation called Double Falsehood by Louis Theobald claims to be derived from the original Cardenio manuscript, but that claim has been debated by scholars for over 200 years. The original, if it survives anywhere, has not been found. Another lost work is called Love's Labours I, mentioned by a writer in 1598 and again in a 1603 booksellers list. It may have been a sequel to Love's Labours Lost or possibly an alternative title for an existing play. No surviving copy carries the name. Other titles attributed in passing to Shakespeare have similarly disappeared from the textual record. What is most striking is that the missing works probably existed in some form during the 17th century. They were performed, they were sold, they were owned, they simply slipped between the cracks of paper and fire and time. Even for the most studied author in English, the most complete editions remain incomplete. A few of his plays survive only as titles, hovering at the edge of the canon like rooms whose doors have been bricked over. Impossible walls. On a hill above Cusco, the ancient capital of the Inca Empire in what is now Peru, sits the fortress of Sacsayhuaman. The Inca built the structure during the 15th century, although portions of it may rest on older foundations. It consists of massive zigzag walls of carefully fitted limestone and granite blocks. The largest blocks weigh over 100 tons. The fitting is so precise that in many places, a knife blade cannot be inserted between the stones, even though no mortar was used. The engineering itself is partly explained. The Inca were skilled stoneworkers who used wooden levers, ropes, ramps, and large workforces to quarry, shape, and transport stone over distances of several kilometers. Experimental archaeology has shown that the techniques, while labor-intensive, are within the capacity of pre-industrial societies. The fitting was achieved by repeated trial, grinding and pounding with harder hammerstones until each block sat snugly against its neighbours. What is harder to explain is the irregular shaping itself. Rather than cutting blocks into uniform rectangles, the Inca shaped each one into a unique polygonal form with many angled faces, then matched the next block to its neighbour. The work required for each individual fit was enormous. The result is a wall that has survived major earthquakes that have destroyed the colonial Spanish buildings constructed alongside it. The shaping pattern, while clearly deliberate, has no obvious practical reason that explains the labour invested. The Inca themselves left no written explanation. Their record-keeping system, the knotted quipu, has not been fully deciphered. Spanish colonizers tore down much of Sacsayhuaman for building stone, leaving the lower courses mostly intact. The largest visible portions of the original work survive, but the deeper question of why the Inca chose to fit their walls in this particular labor-intensive way has gone with the empire that ordered it. Vanished stars. Astronomers maintain comprehensive surveys of the night sky going back over a century. Plates from photographic surveys, automated digital telescopes, and now space-based observatories provide a continuous record of where bright stars are and how they move. Most stars behave predictably. They move slowly across the sky, change brightness in known patterns, and remain detectable across decades. A small number of stars do not. Comparisons between historical sky plates and modern observations have turned up cases where a star was photographed at a specific position in earlier decades, but no source can be detected at the same coordinates today. A project called Vanishing and Appearing Sources during a century of observations, run by an international team, has identified about 100 such cases as candidates for genuine disappearances. Most can be explained without invoking new physics. Faint variable stars dropping below detection limits, old photographic plates with dust or artifacts that looked like stars, optical illusions caused by overlapping sources. After careful review, the list of unexplained candidates shrinks to a much smaller number. A few cases remain in which a clear point source was recorded in an old plate and is genuinely absent in modern follow-up. Possible explanations include exotic stellar collapse, in which a massive star ends its life by forming a black hole without producing a visible supernova. Such direct collapses have been theorized. A handful of candidate events have been observed in nearby galaxies. The full picture is incomplete. Some stars, by all available evidence, have been there one night and gone the next, with no recorded explosion to mark the change. The night sky, watched as carefully as we know how, occasionally drops a light. Ancient battery. In 1938, a German archaeologist named Wilhelm König, working at the National Museum of Iraq, examined a small clay jar that had been recovered from a site near Baghdad. The jar, dating from around the 3rd century, contained a copper cylinder, an iron rod, and traces of organic residue. König proposed that the assembly was, in effect, a primitive battery, capable of producing a small electric current when filled with an acidic liquid like vinegar. Modern reconstructions have shown that such an assembly can indeed produce a voltage of around 1 volt, comparable to a small modern dry cell. The jar, therefore, could have functioned as a battery in principle. Whether it was used that way is a different question. König suggested possible uses for ancient electroplating of metal objects. Other researchers have proposed religious or medical applications, like inducing tingling sensations as part of a ritual. Critics point out that there is no other surviving evidence of ancient electrical knowledge in the region. No wires, no conductive instruments, no textual descriptions of electrical effects. The jars, of which several similar examples have been recovered, are otherwise consistent with ordinary storage vessels of the period. The copper and iron may have served a chemical or magical purpose unrelated to electricity. The original Baghdad jar is also no longer available for inspection. The artifact disappeared from the National Museum of Iraq during the looting that followed the United States-led invasion in 2003. Its current location is unknown. The question of whether a Parthian or Sasanian worker accidentally invented the battery more than 1,000 years before Alessandro Volta will probably never be fully resolved. Last mammoths. Woolly mammoths are usually remembered as creatures of the Ice Age, walking across vast grasslands while humans hunted them with stone-tipped spears. The mainland populations of mammoths did indeed die out around 10,000 years ago, as the climate warmed and grasslands shrank. The story is often told as if their entire species ended then. It did not. On Wrangel Island, in the Arctic Ocean north of Siberia, a small population of mammoths survived for thousands of years longer. Genetic and fossil evidence shows they persisted until around 4,000 years ago, when the Great Pyramids of Egypt had already been built and Sumerian scribes were keeping records in cuneiform. The Wrangel population was small, possibly a few hundred individuals at any given time. They had adapted, become smaller in body size due to island dwarfism, and survived in a slowly warming world long after their mainland cousins were gone. The cause of their final disappearance is not fully understood. Genetic analysis of the last individuals shows accumulated mutations consistent with inbreeding and genetic drift, suggesting the population was already in trouble. A sudden change in climate or fresh water availability may have been the final pressure. Some researchers have suggested that humans, who reached Wrangel Island around the same time, may have played a role, though no clear evidence of human-caused extinction has been found there. What is most striking is the temporal overlap. Somewhere in the same world that contained Stonehenge, the Indus Valley, and the Egyptian Old Kingdom, mammoths were still alive on a single small Arctic island. They lived right up to the edge of the historical record. They simply lived in a place no historian then knew about. By the time the world's map makers noticed Wrangell, the last of the woolly mammoths had been gone for thousands of years. Lost philosophy. Aristotle, the Greek philosopher who tutored Alexander the Great and shaped the foundation of Western thought, produced an enormous body of writing. Ancient catalogues credit him with around 200 works on logic, biology, ethics, politics, poetry, physics, metaphysics, and many other subjects. About 30 of these survive in some form today, mostly as lecture notes or treatises preserved through long chains of medieval copying. The rest are gone. The most famous of the missing works is a treatise on comedy, the lost second book of his Poetics. The surviving Poetics deals primarily with tragedy. A companion volume on comedy is mentioned in ancient sources and was apparently still circulating into the medieval period. It has not been recovered. The Italian writer Umberto Eco built a celebrated novel, The Name of the Rose, around a fictional medieval monastery that secretly preserves and then loses the last copy. Aristotle's lost dialogues, written for a general audience, were widely read in the ancient world. Cicero, who praised them as fluent and elegant, gives quotations from several. The original texts of the dialogues are gone. Most of what survives is in the form of his lecture notes, written for his students, which Cicero himself considered the less polished branch of Aristotle's writing. What is missing matters partly because of its scale. Aristotle was a comprehensive thinker. His surviving works cover much of the ground he addressed, but at second hand through the recollections of pupils and the quotations of later authors. The full picture, with the popular dialogues, the rhetorical treatises, the lost biological catalogues, and the second Poetics, would be substantially different. A figure whose ideas shaped 2,000 years of philosophy left a smaller library to history than he wrote. Hidden planet. In the outer reaches of the solar system, beyond the orbit of Neptune, lies a cold, scattered population of small, icy bodies called the Kuiper Belt. Among these are objects with unusually elongated orbits, some stretching tens of billions of miles from the Sun, that all happen to be tilted and oriented in a similar way. In 2016, the astronomers Mike Brown and Konstantin Batygin proposed that this clustering could be explained by the gravity of an undiscovered planet somewhere in the deep outer solar system, with a mass several times that of Earth. They called the hypothetical body Planet 9. Its expected orbit would lie far beyond Neptune, with a year lasting perhaps 10 or 20,000 Earth years. Its distance from the Sun would make it extremely faint, possibly only a few times brighter than the dimmest objects currently detectable by large telescopes. It might lie in a portion of the sky that is harder to observe because of the band of bright stars from the Milky Way that runs across the search area. Years of dedicated searching have not found it. Wide field surveys have ruled out parts of the predicted orbit. The remaining region is still being scanned. Some astronomers have proposed alternative explanations for the clustered orbits, including observational bias in how Kuiper Belt objects are discovered, and statistical artifacts that may not reflect real grouping. The case for Planet 9 has not collapsed, but it has not been confirmed either. If it exists, Planet 9 has been in our own solar system the entire time. It would be the largest body humans have ever overlooked at close range. If it does not exist, the strange orbits of the outer objects need a different explanation that we have not yet found. Either way, the outer solar system continues to hide something we cannot yet see. Cut stones. In the highlands of Bolivia, near Lake Titicaca, sits the ancient site of Tiwanaku. Within it is a smaller complex called Pumapunku, dating from around the year 500 to 1000. It consists of remarkably precise stonework, including large blocks of red sandstone and dark andesite, cut with sharp right angles, drilled holes, and H-shaped notches that allowed adjacent blocks to lock together without mortar. The precision is the source of the modern fascination. Some of the andesite blocks are cut so cleanly that their surfaces are nearly flat to the millimetre. The largest single stone in the complex weighs more than 100 tons and was transported from a quarry several kilometres away. Modern analyses suggest that the original builders used a combination of skilled stonework, possibly with bronze tools, sand abrasion, and patient labour, to achieve the cuts. What is genuinely missing is any written record by the people who built it. The Tiwanaku culture had no known writing system. By the time the Inca arrived, several centuries after the site had been abandoned, even local traditions about the original builders had become legend. The Inca considered Tiwanaku a place of mythical creation, not historical engineering. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, the site was already in ruins. The combination of impressive precision and absent explanation has made Pumapunku a favourite of fringe theorists who often propose ancient aliens or lost advanced civilizations. The mainstream archaeological answer is more modest. Skilled local people, working with patient methods, achieved exceptional results. The reason for the labour invested and the specific techniques used in the final cutting are not fully known. The builders left their work without leaving an explanation. Stone giants. On Easter Island, called Rapa Nui by its indigenous inhabitants, hundreds of giant stone statues called moai stand or lie across the landscape. The moai were carved by the islanders from volcanic tuff at a single quarry on the slopes of an extinct volcano called Rano Raraku. They were then transported, sometimes for many miles, to platforms along the coast and erected facing inward with their backs to the sea. The largest standing statue is about 10 metres tall and weighs over 70 tons. Hundreds of statues were eventually made over several centuries, from around the year 1200 to 1700. Then the carving stopped. At the quarry, dozens of partially finished statues remain in the rock, abandoned mid-project. Tools were left where workers set them down. The transport routes, the political organisation, and the religious framework that supported the work all ceased to function within a fairly short period. By the time European ships arrived in the 18th century, the islanders no longer carved statues. Inter-tribal warfare during the 17 and 1800s toppled many of the standing moai. By the late 19th century, after waves of disease and slave raiding had devastated the population, the surviving Rapa Nui could no longer reliably explain how their ancestors had moved the moai or why the practice had stopped. Modern research has reconstructed plausible methods, including the use of ropes to rock the statues into a walking motion, and has pieced together evidence about the social conditions that ended the carving. But the everyday knowledge held in the heads of the carvers, the priests, and the leaders is gone. The moai still stare across the island, made by people whose direct descendants no longer remember the details of how they did it. Lost Symphony. Ludwig van Beethoven, the German composer who shaped Western classical music, produced more than 700 catalogued works during his lifetime. The major symphonies, sonatas, quartets, and the single opera are all preserved and continuously performed. But a number of compositions known by reference, by sketch, or by partial manuscript no longer exist as complete and performable works. The most teasing of these is the so-called 10th Symphony. Beethoven began work on a 10th Symphony in the years before his death in 1827. Sketches, themes, and partial outlines have survived. A complete movement of the planned symphony was never finished. Several modern scholars and composers, including the British musicologist Barry Cooper, have attempted to reconstruct portions of the work from the surviving sketches. The reconstructions are educated guesses, not the symphony Beethoven would have produced. A wider range of works are known to have existed in some form. Early student pieces, including operas and orchestral compositions, were partially abandoned or destroyed by Beethoven himself, who was often dissatisfied with his own early efforts. Letters and contemporary references describe pieces that have not been catalogued in any surviving collection. Cantatas, piano pieces, and chamber works that were performed in Vienna during his lifetime are not in modern editions. What is most striking is the survival rate of his finished work, paradoxically. Beethoven was a famous and well-documented composer. His scores were copied, published, and preserved by attentive publishers and friends. Yet pieces of his output have still slipped through the cracks, including the most enticing of all, the incomplete 10th Symphony that the deafening final composer of the Romantic era left unfinished on his desk. Unread tongue. The Etruscans, who lived in what is now Tuscany and parts of central Italy from roughly the 8th century to the 1st century before the Common Era, were a major civilization of pre-Roman Italy. They built cities, traded across the Mediterranean, influenced early Roman architecture and religion, and produced an enormous body of art and inscriptions. Their language, written in an alphabet derived from a Greek model, appears on thousands of surviving inscriptions, including tomb walls, mirrors, and small bronze tablets. Yet despite all that material, Etruscan remains poorly understood. Researchers can read the script. They know how the letters sound. The problem is the language itself, which appears to belong to a small, extinct family with no close relatives. Most surviving texts are short, formulaic, and ritual or funerary in nature. Words for kinship, for offerings, and for the names of the dead are well attested. The grammar, the broader vocabulary, and the deeper structure of the language can only be partially reconstructed. Longer Etruscan texts are rare. The longest surviving example is a religious manuscript called the Liber Linteus, which was reused by accident of history to wrap an Egyptian mummy. The manuscript contains about 1,200 words and 1,000 more that are partially preserved. It is mostly a religious calendar. Even this long text yields only fragmentary understanding of the wider language. Latin gradually displaced Etruscan as Rome expanded. By around the 1st century, native speakers were rare. By the time of the Emperor Claudius, who wrote a multi-volume history of the Etruscans that has not survived, the language was effectively a relic. A people who built cities, fought wars, and shaped a great deal of Roman culture left behind walls of their own words that modern readers can mostly only pronounce, not translate. Lost Rapa Nui. Easter Island, called Rapa Nui by its native people, is one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth. Polynesian settlers reached it sometime between the years 800 and 1200. Over the following centuries, they developed a sophisticated society, built the Moai statues, established complex religious practices, and managed an island of just over 100 square kilometers, far from any neighbor. At their peak, the population may have reached around 15,000 people. By the time European ships first arrived on Easter Sunday in 1722, the society was already in steep decline. The forests that had once covered the island were largely gone. Many of the Moai had been toppled. The population had crashed, perhaps to a few thousand. By the late 19th century, after waves of disease, slave raiding by Peruvian ships, and forced migration, only about 100 indigenous Rapa Nui were left alive. The unbroken transmission of the original culture was nearly extinguished. The cause of the collapse has been debated for decades. The most familiar story, popularized by the writer Jared Diamond, blames internal overexploitation. The Rapa Nui, in this view, deforested their own island, destroyed their soils, and triggered a population crash. A competing view emphasizes external pressures, including the introduction of Polynesian rats that devastated tree seedlings, the impact of contact diseases, and the catastrophic effects of 19th century slave raids. Both schools find evidence in the archaeological record. What is uncontested is the scale of the loss. A complex society with a unique written script, a tradition of monumental stoneworking, and a deep understanding of an extremely remote environment was reduced to a small community of survivors within a few centuries. Most of what they had built and known went with the people who did not survive to teach it. Cave humans. In 2013, cavers exploring the Rising Star cave system in South Africa squeezed through a narrow passage and emerged into a chamber filled with bones. Subsequent excavation by a team led by the paleoanthropologist Lee Berger recovered more than 1,500 fossil fragments belonging to at least 15 individuals of a previously unknown human species. The team named the species Homo naledi. The body of Homo naledi was a strange mosaic. The hands and shoulders looked adapted for climbing. The legs and feet resembled those of modern humans. The brain was small, only about a third the size of a modern human brain, similar in volume to that of a chimpanzee. The species seems to have walked upright on the ground and climbed agilely in trees. The most surprising discovery was the age. Initial guesses placed the bones at perhaps 2 or 3 million years old, based on the primitive features of the skeletons. Later dating shocked the field. The bones are only between 200,000 and 300,000 years old, contemporary with the earliest modern Homo sapiens in Africa. A small-brained, oddly built human species was alive in southern Africa during the same era that modern humans were emerging from the same continent. The cave itself raised additional puzzles. The chamber is extremely difficult to reach, accessible only by squeezing through tight passages in the dark. The presence of so many individuals in one hard-to-access space suggests that the bodies were deliberately placed there. If so, a small-brained human species was performing some kind of mortuary practice, possibly involving the controlled use of fire, well outside the cognitive expectations researchers had for that brain size. The cave still holds bones that have not been removed. Whoever placed them there, and why, walked out and did not leave a label. Unread tablets. On Easter Island, in addition to the giant moai, the Rapa Nui developed a script called Rongorongo. About 24 surviving inscriptions are known, carved on wooden tablets, a staff, and a few other objects. The script consists of small stylized figures of birds, fish, plants, and human shapes, arranged in long lines. Lines alternate in direction. The reader had to turn the tablet upside down at the end of each row to continue reading. The script appears to be unique. It bears no obvious resemblance to any known writing system from elsewhere in Polynesia or beyond. Whether it was developed entirely independently or inspired by contact with European writing, possibly from the Spanish flag-raising ceremony of 1770, is debated. Some researchers argue for an indigenous origin going back centuries. Others argue for a much more recent invention. What is certain is that the meaning has been lost. By the time European missionaries took an interest in the tablets in the 1860s, the slave raids and disease epidemics that devastated the Rapa Nui had killed most of the literate priests. The few surviving informants gave inconsistent and partial readings. None of those readings has been confirmed against an independent source. The script has resisted modern decipherment for over a century. The surviving tablets, scattered in museums around the world, may contain genealogies, religious chants, calendars, or astronomical records, judging by the few clues that exist about their function. None of these guesses can be verified. A complete writing system developed by a small island population, carved into hardwood that survived through a century of upheaval, sits in glass cases under labels that admit, in the end, that no one knows what it says. Lost mothers. In the 1980s, geneticists studying mitochondrial DNA, a small loop of genetic material passed from mother to child through the mother only, calculated that all living humans share a common female ancestor who lived in Africa roughly 150 to 200,000 years ago. She is sometimes called mitochondrial Eve. The name is misleading. She was not the only woman alive at the time. Many women lived in the same era. They were her contemporaries, her sisters, her cousins, her neighbors. What is striking about the calculation is what happened to those contemporaries. The mitochondrial DNA of every woman alive today traces back to this one ancestor, not because she was unique, but because the descendants of every other contemporary woman in the direct, unbroken female line eventually had no daughters. Every other matriline died out. Their bodies have descendants today, through other lines. Their mitochondrial lineages are gone. The mathematics is unforgiving. In any reproducing population, lineages traced through a single sex are constantly being lost. A woman who has only sons leaves no daughters of daughters. Over enough generations, lineage after lineage drops away by simple chance, until only one matriline remains, traceable back to a single ancestor at some specific time in the past. That ancestor shifts over time as more lineages die out. Most of the women alive 100,000 years ago, by this logic, have no female line descendants today. The same is true on the male side, where Y-chromosomal Adam plays the equivalent role. The vast majority of our ancient female ancestors have been quietly erased from the matrilineal record by ordinary statistical drift. They survive only as fractions in the autosomal genome, mixed with everyone else, with no clean line tracing back to any of them in particular. Silent prehistory. For most of human history, there was no writing. Modern humans have been anatomically present for at least 200,000 years. The earliest known writing systems are about 5,000 years old. The first, roughly 5% of the human species span, in other words, is documented. The other 95% is mostly silent. Anatomically modern people during that vast, unrecorded span lived complex lives. They told stories, sang songs, mourned their dead, fell in love, fought wars, named the constellations, and explained the rains. They invented language. They settled and abandoned countless places. They produced enormous bodies of oral knowledge, myth, ritual, and craft. Almost none of it has come down to us in their own words. What survives is mostly indirect. Stone tools, cave paintings, burials with grave goods, fragmentary skeletons. From these, archaeologists infer behavior, diet, migration, and sometimes belief. The inferences are real, but they are at a distance. The voices that produced the tools and painted the caves spoke languages that have left no trace. The words for love and hunger and God, in tens of thousands of forgotten tongues, were not written down. A handful of the very oldest oral traditions may have transmitted echoes of the deep past through stories of floods or mountains or vanished animals. Most have not been preserved. The silence of deep time is structural. It is not that the people were quiet. It is that nothing they could do, in the absence of writing, could carry the sound of their voices forward to us. The great majority of human experience, by sheer volume, has happened to people we will never be able to quote. The last speaker of a language carries everything and then is gone. Languages die in many ways. Some are slowly displaced by neighbours over generations. Some are forced out by colonial or imperial policy. Some shrink as their speakers shift to a more economically useful tongue. Whatever the path, the end is the same. There is always, in principle, a last speaker, the final person on earth who can still think and dream in the language as a native. Linguists have documented this final moment many times. In the 1970s, Marie Smith Jones lived in Anchorage, Alaska, as the last speaker of Ayak, a language once spoken along the Gulf of Alaska coast. She died in 2008. In 2010, an elderly woman named Boa Senior passed away in the Andaman Islands, taking with her the Bo language, which had been spoken in the region for 65,000 years. In 2021, Cristina Calderon died in Chile, the last fluent native speaker of the Yagan language. Hundreds of similar deaths have been recorded around the world in the last century alone. What a last speaker carries is more than vocabulary. They hold the rhythms of phrases, the jokes that only work in that language, the small grammatical decisions made unconsciously by speakers who learn the tongue from infancy. Recordings can capture some of this. They cannot capture all of it. When the last speaker dies, the language stops being a living thing, even if dictionaries, grammars, and word lists remain. Of the roughly 7,000 languages still spoken today, linguists estimate that half will have no fluent speakers by the end of this century. Each one, when it ends with a particular person. The world becomes a slightly smaller place to think in. The silence at the end of every language is not the silence of forgetting. It is the silence of a final voice, closing a door behind it.